The endless void of space stretched out in every direction, cold and silent. Ethan's spacecraft sputtered as sparks flew from the damaged console. The alarms blared, and red lights painted the cockpit in a frantic glow. He slammed his fists against the controls, desperate to regain control. The ship spiraled, a victim of its own malfunction, and gravity yanked Ethan hard against his seat as the craft hurtled toward the surface of an unknown planet. A fiery crash erupted in a remote part of the alien world, leaving the craft twisted and smoking. Ethan groaned, his body bruised, and his vision blurred. His helmet's oxygen gauge blinked critically, urging him to act fast. But his strength was failing. He managed to crawl out of the wreckage before collapsing onto the soft, blue grass that blanketed the terrain. Above, another ship silently approached, its sleek silver hull gleaming under the planet's two suns. Captain Lyra watched the scene from the bridge of her starship. Her violet skin glowed softly in the dim light, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders as she examined the wreck on the planet's surface. A human. Her second-in-command, Roran, said, his tone laced with disdain. "We should leave him. His kind bring nothing but trouble." Lyra narrowed her sharp, amethyst eyes at the screen. "He's injured. I won't abandon him." "Captain, you're risking the crew for one outsider," Roran protested. "Enough," Lyra said firmly. "Prepare a recovery team. We're bringing him aboard." Moments later, Lyra herself descended to the surface in a small shuttle, flanked by two crew members. She approached the wreckage cautiously, her senses sharp. Ethan lay unconscious, his breathing shallow. She knelt beside him, her expression softening. "Fragile," she muttered to herself, noticing how small and vulnerable the human seemed. With practiced hands, she scanned him with a medical device, stabilizing his vitals. The crew hesitated. "Captain, this isn't wise," one of them murmured. Lyra ignored the comment. "Help me lift him. He'll die if we leave him here." Back aboard Lyra's starship, Ethan was placed in a sterile medical bay. Advanced machines worked tirelessly to mend his wounds. Lyra stayed nearby, her arms crossed as she observed the process. "Why risk so much for him?" Roran asked, standing in the doorway. Lyra didn't look at him. "Because it's the right thing to do." Roran scoffed but said nothing more. Hours later, Ethan stirred. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the soft lighting of the room. The sterile smell and the quiet hum of machines made it clear he wasn't on Earth, or his ship. Panic flared in his chest until his gaze landed on Lyra, standing a few feet away. "Where am I?" Ethan croaked. "You're safe," Lyra said calmly, her voice smooth and steady. "You crashed on a remote planet. We found you just in time." Ethan blinked, trying to process her words. His eyes took in her violet skin, her glowing eyes, and the uniform she wore. He knew instantly she wasn't human. "You saved me?" he asked weakly. Lyra nodded. "Yes, but don't thank me yet. You're not fully out of danger." Ethan tried to sit up, but pain shot through his side, forcing him back down. "Why? Why did you help me?" Lyra hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because no one deserves to die alone." Ethan stared at her, grateful but wary. He had no idea where he was or who these people were, but one thing was clear: this captain had saved his life. And for now, he owed her everything. Ethan's body still ached as he lay on the soft, metallic surface of the medical bed. The room was quiet, except for the gentle hum of machinery. He turned his head and caught sight of Captain Lyra standing near the doorway. Her violet skin shimmered faintly under the sterile light, and her silver hair framed her sharp, yet strangely kind, features. "How are you feeling?" Lyra asked, her voice calm but carrying a note of authority. "Like I got hit by a meteor," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "Where am I?" "You're aboard my ship, the Aurora Blade," Lyra said. "You were lucky we found you." Ethan blinked, trying to process everything. His last memory was of his ship spiraling out of control, alarms screaming in his ears. Now he was in a place that felt far beyond human technology. "You saved me," he said, his gaze locking with hers. Lyra nodded. "Yes, but not everyone here agrees with that decision." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Why? Did I crash into someone's backyard?" A flicker of amusement crossed Lyra's face, but it quickly faded. "Humans aren't exactly trusted in this part of the galaxy. Some of my crew think bringing you aboard was a mistake." Ethan frowned. "Well, thanks for doing it anyway. I'd probably be dead out there if it wasn't for you." Lyra nodded slightly but didn't reply. Her gaze shifted toward the door as it slid open, revealing Roran. His tall, broad figure and piercing blue eyes gave him an imposing presence. "The human is awake," Roran said, his tone cold. "Captain, I need to speak with you." Lyra glanced at Ethan. "Rest. You need to recover." Ethan watched as she left with Roran, the door sliding shut behind them. He exhaled heavily, unsure whether to feel safe or nervous. In the corridor outside, Roran's voice was low but intense. "Captain, we shouldn't trust him. He could be a spy. Or worse." Lyra crossed her arms. "He's injured and alone. What threat could he possibly pose?" "You're risking the safety of the entire crew," Roran argued. "Humans are unpredictable." Lyra's gaze hardened. "Unpredictable doesn't mean dangerous. And until he proves otherwise, he's under my protection." Back in the medical bay, Ethan sat up slowly, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. The room was small but filled with advanced technology he couldn't even begin to understand. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and tried to stand, but his legs wobbled. "Take it easy," a soft voice said. Ethan turned to see a young crew member with emerald green skin and large, curious eyes. She held a tray of food and water. "Thanks," Ethan said as she placed the tray on a small table beside him. The crew member hesitated, her gaze lingering on him. "You're the first human I've ever seen." Ethan chuckled weakly. "Hope I'm not a disappointment." She tilted her head. "You're smaller than I thought. And softer." "Thanks, I guess," Ethan said, not sure whether to laugh or feel insulted. The crew member quickly left, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He stared at the strange food on the tray, which looked like glowing cubes and a pale liquid that smelled faintly sweet. His stomach growled, and he decided to take a chance. As he ate, the door opened again, and Lyra stepped inside. "You're up," she said, her tone neutral. "Yeah, I don't think lying around is going to get me back to Earth," Ethan replied. Lyra studied him for a moment before speaking. "Earth is far from here, Ethan. Even if your ship was intact, the chances of you making it back alone are slim." Ethan's chest tightened. "So, what now?" "For now, you recover," Lyra said. "After that, we'll see." Ethan nodded, his mind racing with questions. One thing was clear. His fate was now tied to this mysterious captain and her crew. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, only time would tell. Ethan slowly adjusted to life aboard the Aurora Blade. The days blurred together as his body healed, but his mind remained restless. He was stranded, far from Earth, surrounded by technology and people he barely understood. Yet, every interaction with the crew brought new surprises, especially with Captain Lyra. One afternoon, Lyra invited him to the observation deck. The room was vast, its walls made of clear material that revealed the breathtaking expanse of space. Stars twinkled like diamonds, and distant nebulae painted the black canvas with streaks of vibrant color. Ethan couldn't help but gasp at the view. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Lyra said, standing beside him. Her voice held a rare softness. "It's incredible," Ethan replied, his gaze glued to the stars. "Earth has its beauty, but this is something else." Lyra smiled faintly. "You speak of Earth often. Tell me about it." Ethan leaned against the railing, thinking. "Earth is complicated. It's noisy, crowded, and messy, but it's also full of life. Mountains, oceans, forests, all different, but somehow connected. And then there's us, humans. We're stubborn, curious, always trying to figure things out. Lyra tilted her head, her silver hair catching the light. Humans sound unpredictable. Ethan laughed. That's one way to put it. What about your people? What's your home like? Lyra's expression grew distant. My world, Celoria, is a place of order. Our cities are vast, built to harmonize with the land. We value unity and discipline. But sometimes, I wonder if we've lost something. Spontaneity, perhaps. Ethan nodded. Sounds like you could use a little human chaos. Lyra chuckled softly. Perhaps. As the days passed, Ethan found ways to contribute to the ship. He had always been good with his hands, and the Aurora blade presented endless challenges. One day, he stumbled upon an engineering bay filled with strange humming machines. He couldn't resist examining one of the devices, its design both alien and fascinating. What are you doing? A voice snapped behind him. Ethan turned to see Roran, his arms crossed and his expression cold. Just curious, Ethan said, holding up his hands. I wasn't trying to break anything. Roran stepped closer, his towering figure intimidating. You shouldn't be here. This ship isn't your playground. Before Ethan could respond, Lyra entered the room. Her gaze shifted between the two men. What's going on? Roran straightened. The human is poking around where he doesn't belong. Lyra frowned but looked at Ethan. Is that true? I wasn't poking around, Ethan said defensively. I was just trying to understand how things work. Maybe even help. Lyra studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the machine he'd been inspecting. What do you see? Ethan hesitated, then pointed to a cluster of wires. That connection looks frayed. If it snaps, it could overload the system. Roran snorted, as if he knows anything about our technology. But Lyra crouched beside the machine, examining the wires. Her expression shifted slightly, a mix of surprise and intrigue. He's right. Roran's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Lyra stood and looked at Ethan. If you want to help, let me show you the proper way. Ethan grinned. I'd like that. Over time, Ethan's presence became less of a disruption and more of an asset. He brought a fresh perspective to the crew, offering ideas that were unconventional but effective. Lyra began to see him not just as a guest, but as someone who could contribute meaningfully. One evening, as they worked together in the engineering bay, Ethan glanced at Lyra. Why did you really save me? Lyra paused, her hand stilling on the console. Because I saw someone who needed help. Someone worth saving. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. For the first time since his crash, he felt a spark of hope. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming part of something bigger. The Aurora blade drifted through the quiet expanse of space. Ethan had begun to feel a strange sense of belonging aboard the ship. He worked alongside the crew, learning their customs, their language, and even some of their advanced technology. Though not everyone trusted him, Captain Lyra's confidence in him had started to change a few minds. But peace aboard the ship didn't last long. One evening, as the crew gathered in the dining hall, the ship's alarms blared, shattering the calm. Red lights flashed, and Lyra's voice echoed through the ship's intercom. All crew to battle stations. This is not a drill. Ethan, startled, followed the rushing crew to the command deck. When he arrived, the large screen at the front of the room displayed a massive alien vessel closing in on them. The ship was angular and menacing, with glowing red lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. Who are they? Ethan asked, moving to stand beside Lyra. The Drelkins, Lyra said, her voice sharp. Pirates. They raid smaller ships for supplies, then leave no survivors. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What do we do? Lyra turned to her crew. Shields up. Prepare evasive maneuvers. The ship rocked as the first volley of energy blasts struck their shields. Lyra's crew worked with practiced precision, but the enemy ship was relentless. It was clear the Aurora Blade couldn't outgun them. "They're targeting our engines," Roran said, his voice tense. Lyra's jaw tightened. "We can't let them disable us. Prepare countermeasures." Ethan watched the scene unfold, feeling helpless. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a pilot who had stumbled into their world. But as the ship shuddered under another attack, an idea formed in his mind. "Lyra," he said urgently, "what if we outthink them?" Lyra turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Ethan pointed to the screen. "They're bigger and stronger, but that means they're slower, right? If we use the debris field from that asteroid belt nearby, we can force them to split their focus. We might even shake them off." Roran scoffed. "And risk the ship colliding with an asteroid. Ridiculous." "It's risky," Ethan admitted, "but staying here is worse." Lyra studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Helm, set a course for the asteroid belt. All hands, brace for impact." The Aurora Blade veered sharply, speeding toward the jagged rocks floating in space. The Drelkin ship followed, its weapons firing relentlessly. Ethan watched as the crew worked together, weaving the ship through the chaotic field of debris. The plan seemed to work. The larger Drelkin vessel struggled to maneuver, its bulky frame clipping smaller asteroids. But the pirates were persistent, and their weapons tore through the field, narrowly missing the Aurora Blade. "We need to distract them," Lyra said, her mind racing. "I can help," Ethan said suddenly. Lyra frowned. "How?" "Let me take one of your small fighters," Ethan said. "I can lure them into the densest part of the field. If they follow, they'll be crushed." Roran stepped forward. "This is insane. He's untrained in our ships." Ethan looked at Lyra, his expression determined. "I can do it. Trust me." Lyra hesitated, but the desperation in the situation left her little choice. "Fine. Get him to the fighter bay," she ordered. Minutes later, Ethan climbed into one of the sleek, single-pilot fighters. The controls were unfamiliar, but he'd studied enough of the ship's systems to manage. As he launched into space, the enemy ship immediately locked onto him. Ethan's heart pounded as he flew toward the thickest part of the asteroid belt. The Drelkin ship followed, its weapons blazing. Ethan weaved through the rocks, narrowly avoiding collisions. Finally, the pirate's ship made a fatal misstep. Its massive hull struck a cluster of asteroids, and a resulting explosion lit up the darkness of space. The enemy was defeated. Ethan returned to the Aurora Blade, his hand shaking, but his heart triumphant. As he stepped out of the fighter, Lyra was waiting for him. "You took a big risk," she said, her voice calm, but with a hint of admiration. Ethan grinned. "Worked, didn't it?" Lyra's lips curved into a small smile. "Yes, it did." For the first time, Ethan felt like he had truly earned his place aboard the ship. But he knew this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. The aftermath of the battle left the Aurora Blade shaken but intact. Repairs were underway, and the crew worked tirelessly to restore the ship's systems. Despite their exhaustion, there was a newfound respect for Ethan. His daring maneuver in the asteroid belt had saved them all. Even those who had doubted him couldn't deny his bravery. Ethan, however, didn't have time to rest. He worked alongside the engineers, his knowledge of human mechanics blending surprisingly well with the alien technology. The crew still gave him wary glances, but some offered nods of approval as he passed. One evening, while adjusting a damaged energy conduit in the engineering bay, Ethan heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Lyra standing there, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "You should be resting," she said. Ethan smirked. "Says the captain who hasn't left the bridge since the battle." Lyra's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Fair point. How are you holding up?" "Honestly," Ethan said, leaning against the wall. "I'm tired, but I don't mind. I owe this crew, you, for saving me." Lyra studied him for a moment before stepping closer. You've done more than enough to prove yourself, Ethan. You don't owe us anything. Ethan shrugged. Maybe not. But I don't want to be just a guest here. I want to pull my weight. Lyra nodded, appreciating his resolve. And you have. More than most would in your situation. As they spoke, Roran entered the bay, his expression as cold as ever. Captain, a word, he said, ignoring Ethan entirely. Lyra excused herself, and Ethan watched them leave, sensing tension in the air. Roran's distrust had been evident from the start, but it seemed to have deepened after the battle. In the captain's quarters, Roran's voice was sharp. Captain, this human is becoming a problem. Lyra raised an eyebrow. A problem? He just saved our lives. That's exactly my point, Roran said. The crew is starting to look up to him. They're questioning your judgment because of him. Lyra's expression hardened. Questioning my judgment. Or yours, Roran. Roran hesitated but pressed on. He's a wild card. You're risking everything for someone we barely know. I trust him, Lyra said firmly. And until he gives me a reason not to, he stays. Roran's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. As he left, his eyes flicked toward the engineering bay, a flicker of something dark crossing his face. Unaware of Roran's growing hostility, Ethan continued his work. Over the next few days, he noticed subtle changes in the crew's behavior. Tools would go missing, systems he repaired would mysteriously malfunction, and whispers followed him wherever he went. One evening, while Ethan was double-checking the repairs on the ship's power core, the alarms blared again. This time, it wasn't an enemy attack, but an internal emergency. The ship's core was destabilizing, threatening to explode. Ethan sprinted to the bridge, where chaos reigned. Lyra was barking orders, her calm demeanor replaced by urgency. What happened? Ethan asked. The power core is overheating, Lyra said. If we can't stabilize it, the ship is done for. Ethan's mind raced. I can fix it, he said, but I'll need someone to guide me through the secondary systems. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. Do it. Ethan rushed to the core chamber, the heat almost unbearable. As he worked to reroute power, he realized something was wrong. This wasn't an accident. The core's failure was deliberate, sabotage. Despite the danger, Ethan focused, his hands moving swiftly over the controls. With seconds to spare, he stabilized the core, and the alarms fell silent. Exhausted, he slumped against the wall, sweat pouring down his face. Back on the bridge, Lyra confronted Roran. This wasn't an accident, she said, her voice cold. You've been against him from the start. Roran's face darkened, but he didn't deny it. He doesn't belong here. You don't get to decide that, Lyra said, her voice sharp. You endangered the entire crew. You're relieved of duty. Roran glared at her, but didn't resist as he was escorted away. Later, Lyra found Ethan in the engineering bay, still catching his breath. You saved us again, she said. Ethan looked at her, his exhaustion clear. Just doing my part. Lyra's gaze softened. You've done more than your part, Ethan. You've earned your place here. For the first time, Ethan felt truly accepted. The Aurora Blade was no longer just a refuge. It was home. The tension aboard the Aurora Blade lingered after Roran's removal from duty. While most of the crew silently approved of Lyra's decision, whispers of dissent spread. Ethan couldn't help but feel uneasy. Despite Lyra's reassurance, he knew not everyone trusted him. Ethan continued working alongside the crew, doing his best to earn their trust. His human ingenuity proved useful, especially when adapting their systems to survive the harsh conditions of space. Slowly, some crew members began to acknowledge his efforts with nods or the occasional word of thanks. One quiet evening, Ethan found himself in the observation deck, staring out at the vast emptiness of space. Lyra joined him, her steps silent but purposeful. She stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. You seem troubled, Lyra said, her voice gentle. Ethan sighed. It's hard to shake the feeling that I don't belong here. I know I've helped, but some of your crew, they still look at me like I'm an outsider." Lyra turned to face him, her amethyst eyes soft. "Trust takes time, Ethan. You've done more for this ship than most would in your position. But change doesn't come easily for everyone." Ethan nodded, appreciating her words. "Thanks, Lyra. That means a lot." Before she could respond, the ship jolted violently. Alarms blared, and the lights flickered. Lyra's communicator crackled to life. "Captain, we've got a breach in engineering," a panicked voice reported. Lyra and Ethan exchanged a tense glance before rushing to the engineering bay. When they arrived, chaos greeted them. Smoke filled the air, and sparks flew from damaged consoles. Crew members scrambled to contain the situation. "What happened?" Lyra demanded. One of the engineers pointed toward the main console. "Someone tampered with the coolant system. It's overheating. If we don't fix it, the ship will lose power, and the core might go critical again." Ethan's mind raced. "I can handle it," he said, stepping forward. Lyra hesitated. "It's dangerous. The heat levels are already extreme." "I'll be fine," Ethan said, determination in his voice. "Just guide me through the secondary systems." Lyra nodded, her trust in him unwavering. As Ethan moved toward the overheating core, he noticed subtle signs of sabotage. Tools left out of place, wires intentionally cut. This wasn't an accident. Someone had planned this. With sweat dripping down his face, Ethan worked quickly, his hands steadied despite the rising heat. He rerouted power and repaired the damaged lines, but the system was still unstable. He needed to manually release the pressure buildup, a task that required venturing dangerously close to the core. "You can't go in there," Lyra said over the communicator. "The radiation levels are too high." "It's the only way," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "If I don't, the whole ship could go down." Lyra's silence spoke volumes, but she finally said, "Be careful." Ethan donned protective gear and stepped into the core chamber. The heat was intense, and the hum of the core was deafening. He moved quickly, releasing the pressure valves one by one. With each turn of the wrench, the core's stability improved, but his strength waned. Finally, the alarm stopped. The core stabilized, and the ship's systems hummed back to life. Ethan stumbled out of the chamber, his body weak but intact. Lyra was there to catch him as he collapsed. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with relief. "Just doing my part," Ethan said weakly, managing a small smile. Later, in the debriefing room, Lyra confronted the crew. "This was no accident," she said, her voice cold. "Someone sabotaged this ship, endangering all of us." Her words hung heavy in the air, and the crew exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan sat nearby, his exhaustion evident, but his mind racing. Whoever was behind the sabotage wasn't done yet, and they wouldn't stop until the Aurora blade was destroyed. Lyra's eyes met Ethan's, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They would find the traitor together, no matter the cost. The bond they shared had grown unshakable, forged in the fires of danger and trust. Ethan was no longer just a passenger. He was part of the Aurora Blade's family, and he would fight to protect it. The Aurora Blade was finally calm, but the quiet felt like the calm before a storm. Ethan could sense the unease among the crew. Sabotage didn't just damage the ship, it eroded trust. Everyone was on edge, wondering who among them might betray them next. Captain Lyra called for a meeting in the command room. The crew gathered, their faces tense, their movements wary. Ethan stood near the back, feeling the weight of every suspicious glance thrown his way. He knew he was still an easy target for blame. Lyra's commanding presence filled the room as she addressed her crew. "We have a problem. Someone aboard this ship is working against us. They've risked all our lives, and until we find out who it is, none of us are truly safe." Murmurs rippled through the room, and Lyra silenced them with a sharp look. "I won't tolerate division. We must stay united if we're to survive." Her words carried authority, but the unease lingered. Ethan decided to speak up. "I know I'm the outsider here," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "But I've risked my life for this crew, just like all of you. If we're going to get through this, we need to work together." Some crew members nodded reluctantly, while others remained skeptical. Lyra gave Ethan a small, approving nod before continuing. "Our first priority is to ensure the ship is fully operational. After that, we're heading for Soloria. The Drulkan pirates won't stop with one attack. My homeworld is their next target." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Soloria? Do you think they'll attack it directly?" Lyra nodded grimly. "The Drulkans are desperate. If they succeed, it could destabilize the entire region of space." Ethan felt a surge of determination. "Then we stop them." The crew dispersed, each member returning to their duties. Ethan joined the engineering team to assist with repairs, but the question of the saboteur nagged at the back of his mind. Who would betray their own crew, and why? Late that night, as the ship drifted silently through space, Ethan decided to investigate. He combed through the maintenance logs and security footage, looking for anything out of place. Hours passed, and just when he was about to give up, he found something. A subtle anomaly in the access logs to the core chamber. Someone had entered just before the sabotage, and it wasn't Ethan. He took his findings to Lyra. She examined the logs, her expression darkening. "Roran," she said quietly. Even after being relieved of duty, he still had access. Ethan's stomach churned. "What do we do?" Lyra's jaw tightened. "We confront him." Together, they found Roran in the cargo bay, working on a console. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. "Captain." "Ethan," he said, his tone neutral. "We know what you did," Lyra said, her voice cold. "You sabotaged the ship." Roran straightened, his face hardening. "I did what I thought was necessary. You've let this human worm his way into our crew. He's a liability." Ethan stepped forward, anger flaring. "A liability? I've saved this ship twice. What have you done except endanger everyone?" Roran sneered. "You don't belong here, and I won't let you destroy what we've built." Lyra raised a hand, silencing both men. "Roran, your actions have already done more harm than anything Ethan could. You've betrayed this crew, and for that, you'll face the consequences." Before Roran could respond, security officers arrived, escorting him away. His defiant glare lingered on Ethan as he was led out. With Roran detained, Lyra and Ethan returned to the bridge. The mood was somber, but there was a sense of relief. The saboteur had been caught, and the ship could finally move forward. As they prepared for their mission to Soloria, Lyra turned to Ethan. "You've proven yourself again and again, Ethan. I'm glad you're here." Ethan smiled, a sense of belonging settling over him. "I'm glad to be here." The Aurora Blade set course for Soloria, its crew united once more. The real battle was yet to come, but for the first time, Ethan felt ready to face it. Together with Lyra and her crew, he was determined to protect their future. The Aurora Blade entered Soloria's orbit, the sight of the shimmering planet filling the view screen. Its vast cities sparkled like stars against the surface, a testament to its people's advanced civilization. Yet the tension on the bridge was palpable. Everyone knew the Drulkan pirates wouldn't wait long to launch their attack. Ethan stood beside Captain Lyra, his gaze fixed on the planet below. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Lyra nodded, but her focus remained sharp. "It is, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." An alert interrupted their conversation, and the ship's sensors lit up. The Drulkan fleet had arrived, their massive warships cutting through the darkness of space. The bridge crew scrambled to their stations, the air thick with urgency. "They're positioning to blockade the planet," Lyra said, her tone cold and decisive. "We can't let them. Prepare for combat." The crew moved with practiced precision, but Ethan could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about survival. It was about saving an entire world. As the Aurora blade surged forward, Lyra's voice rang out. Target their lead ship. We'll break their formation. The ship's weapon systems roared to life, firing precise volleys of energy at the enemy. Explosions lit up the void as smaller Drelkin vessels were destroyed, but the lead ship held strong, its shields absorbing the attacks. Ethan's mind raced. Lyra, their flagship is too well defended. We need to get creative. What do you suggest? She asked, her eyes never leaving the screen. Divide their forces, Ethan said. If we draw some of their ships away, we can weaken their defenses and take out the flagship. Lyra nodded. A risky plan, but it might work. She turned to her crew. Prepare the decoy drones. Launch them on my command. The drones were deployed, mimicking the Aurora blade's signature as they darted away from the main battle. As Ethan predicted, several Drelkin ships broke off to pursue them, leaving the flagship more vulnerable. Now's our chance, Lyra said. All power to forward weapons. The Aurora blade charged toward the flagship, firing relentlessly. The enemy's shields flickered under the assault, and Ethan could see cracks forming in their formation. But the Drelkins weren't giving up easily. Their ships unleashed a counterattack, shaking the Aurora blade violently. Shields at 40%. A crew member shouted. Lyra's jaw tightened. Hold steady. We're not done yet. Ethan gripped the edge of the console, an idea forming in his mind. Their shields are strong, but their engines are exposed. If we disable them, they'll be sitting ducks. Lyra glanced at him, then nodded. Helm. Reposition. Target their engines. The ship veered sharply, dodging enemy fire as it moved into position. The crew worked in unison, their trust in Lyra and Ethan, propelling them forward. Fire, Lyra commanded. The Aurora blade's weapons struck the enemy's engines with pinpoint accuracy. Sparks erupted from the flagship as its propulsion systems failed, leaving it vulnerable. The Drelkin fleet hesitated, their formation faltering. Lyra seized the opportunity. Broadcast to all enemy ships. Tell them to stand down or face destruction. The message was sent, and for a tense moment, silence filled the air. Then, one by one, the Drelkin ships began retreating, their confidence shattered. Cheers erupted on the bridge, but Ethan remained focused. What about the flagship? Lyra's expression hardened. We board it. Their leader must answer for this. Ethan volunteered to join the boarding party, and together with Lyra and a small team, they stormed the enemy ship. The corridors were dark and cold, the scent of burnt metal filling the air. They encountered resistance, but their training and determination pushed them through. Finally, they reached the bridge. The Drelkin commander stood there, defiant but cornered. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady. This ends now. The commander sneered but lowered his weapon, knowing he was outmatched. The battle was over. As they returned to the Aurora blade, Ethan felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. You were right, she said. We needed your creativity to win this fight. Ethan smiled, the bond between them stronger than ever. Together, they had protected Celoria, and in doing so, proven that even the most unlikely alliances could achieve greatness. But Ethan knew their journey wasn't over yet. There were still challenges ahead, and he was ready to face them by Lyra's side. The aftermath of the battle left the crew of the Aurora blade exhausted but victorious. Celoria was safe, its shining cities untouched, and the Drelkin fleet was scattered. The bridge of the ship was filled with quiet relief as the crew finally had a moment to breathe. Ethan stood near one of the large observation windows, watching Celoria's shimmering surface below. He still couldn't believe they had won. The odds had been stacked against them, but together, they had prevailed. For the first time since his crash, Ethan felt more than just a visitor. He felt like he belonged. Captain Lyra approached, her presence calm yet commanding. She stood beside him, her gaze also fixed on the planet below. You've been quiet, she said. Ethan glanced at her, a small smile on his face. Just thinking. A lot's happened since I woke up on this ship. Lyra nodded. More than most face in a lifetime. They stood in silence for a moment before Ethan spoke again. Why did you save me, Lyra? I mean, really. She turned to him, her amethyst eyes soft. When I found you, I saw someone who refused to give up, even in the face of death. That kind of determination. It's rare. I knew you were someone worth saving. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. Thanks to you, I had a chance to prove it. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from the communications officer. Captain, we have a message from Soloria's council. They're requesting your presence. Lyra sighed, the weight of her responsibilities clear on her face. Duty calls. She started to walk away, but Ethan's voice stopped her. Lyra, wait. She turned, curiosity flickering in her expression. Yes. I've been thinking. I don't know if I'll ever make it back to Earth. And honestly, I don't know if I want to. He took a deep breath. I want to stay. Here. With you. With this crew. Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time, a genuine smile broke through her usual composure. Are you sure, Ethan? Life out here isn't easy. Ethan nodded firmly. I've faced danger, sabotage, and pirates. I think I'm getting the hang of it. Lyra chuckled, a sound that warmed the cold air of the observation deck. Then I'd be honored to have you as part of the crew, but you'll need a proper role. Ethan grinned. I think I've proven I'm good at fixing things. More than that, Lyra said. You've brought something this crew was missing. Hope. That's more valuable than any skill. The announcement of Ethan officially joining the crew was met with mixed reactions, but most had grown to respect him after everything he had done. Even the most skeptical members couldn't deny he had earned his place. As the Aurora Blade prepared for its next mission, Ethan settled into his new life. He worked alongside the crew, learning their ways and teaching them a few of his own. His bond with Lyra deepened, built on mutual trust and admiration. Though they came from different worlds, their connection felt unshakable. One evening, as the ship cruised through the quiet expanse of space, Lyra found Ethan in the engineering bay, tinkering with a small drone. She leaned against the doorway, watching him work. You never stop, do you? She said, a teasing note in her voice. Ethan looked up, a smudge of grease on his cheek. Can't afford to. Someone's got to keep this ship running. Lyra stepped closer, her tone softer. You've done more than that, Ethan. You've given this crew a reason to believe in something bigger than themselves. Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years. And you've given me a place to call home. Lyra extended her hand, and Ethan took it without hesitation. Together, they stood in the heart of the ship, two unlikely allies bound by a shared purpose and an unspoken promise. As the stars stretched endlessly before them, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was part of something extraordinary, a crew, a family, and a future he couldn't have imagined. And with Lyra by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next.